lecture is on persuasion. I'm going to go through some of the important points from this chapter as kind of a quick overview or lecture covering these issues. You should have read the you should have watched the Science of Persuasion YouTube video already, which is part of what this particular lecture talks about, but I'm going to go ahead and go through a few things additionally as well. So persuasion, in terms of a general definition, is simply the process by which a message induces change in beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors. So it's the way in which messages that are given in a variety of different channels, venues, or mediums can have an effect on us and change either what we believe about something or different actions that we have. So persuasion can be done, can do a lot of different sorts of things. So it can be used to spread false beliefs, can change attitudes around equality, can be related to things like a climate change, either to hinder work towards climate change or to improve things about climate change, or it can be used to help things like promoting healthier living. There's two primary routes in terms of persuasion. There's the central route and the peripheral route. And you can kind of think about these in terms of System 1 and System 2 processes. So we've covered System 1 and System 2 processes already, and that's basically looking at the difference between controlled reasoning that uses rationality, and then in our second system, which works primarily at the level of the unconscious. And so the central route would correspond to our more rational, logical sorts of thinking. And this occurs when arguments are discussed, listened to, and thought about. And based on the type of persuasion used in the arguments or the rationale for it, we can change our minds about different things, which may change different behaviors as well. The peripheral route is more of the unconscious route. And a lot of times, because there's so many things going on in our world, sometimes we can be changed through more of the unconscious level. So the peripheral route to persuasion occurs when people are influenced by other kinds of cues, such as a speaker's attractiveness. And so peripheral routes focus more on things that trigger an automatic acceptance, or it could even be an automatic rejection of different sorts of things. So probably the best way to think about it is central route is more conscious, the conscious deliberation about a particular point, whereas the peripheral route is more of the unconscious sorts of forces or causes that have an effect on what we believe about certain kinds of things or our ability to be persuaded. So this is kind of several different hurdles that we can run into in the persuasion process. So as you can see, there's a lot of places where persuasion can break down. So the first step is simply, are you paying attention to the message at all? Are you actually seeing it? Secondly, can you actually even comprehend what that message is? So do you understand what it's saying? Thirdly, do you believe it? Do you affirm what it is that's being saying? Then secondly, even if you believe it, will you remember it? So will it stay in your mind long enough to actually influence your thoughts, beliefs, and actions? Then, of course, fourth step is, will you behave accordingly? So will you follow some sort of what caused you to do something or change your behavior? And then finally, the following action. So why this is important is just to demonstrate that there's several different places where the persuasion process can begin to break down. And if any one of these particular steps, if it's not paid attention to, or if something goes wrong, then there'll be no action taken. So there's a lot of things, there's a lot of hurdles that must be crossed in order to persuade us to do different sorts of things. The central route usually leads to more enduring change than the peripheral route. So when people usually think about things carefully and they don't rely on persuasive appeals, but on their own thoughts and response, it can actually cause more long-term sorts of change in people's beliefs and thoughts. The peripheral route, however, is often much quicker, meaning it's easier to get results and easier to influence people to do different sorts of things. So as we talked about a lot in this class in social psych, there's a lot of different rules of thumb, the heuristics that we use, or kind of simple yes-no kinds of tactics for trying to decide whether we believe something or not, whether we trust something or not. And so because of the amount of information that we often run into in the world, we oftentimes have to take the peripheral route because there's just too much for us to have to deal with. So because of that, we'll use other routes, such as trust the experts, or longer messages are credible, or we'll we'll make our decisions based on whether a speaker is articulate or appealing, whether they have good arguments, and so on and so forth. So there's a couple different elements to persuasion. The primary elements are who is the communicator, so who is communicating something, what is the message, so what is the content of the message, and then how is the content of that message communicated, and then what's the audience. And at each of these different ingredients of persuasion can be influenced in different ways in terms of changing our mind or causing us to think different sorts of things. So first stop is looking at the communicator itself. So what is the person actually saying? And what is the person who is saying these things? And one important aspect of that is credibility, which is also could be known as believability. And so credibility is basically whether or not someone is seen as either an expert in some kind of area or whether they're seen as a trustworthy or not. Another kind of effect that can arise here too is what's known as the sleeper effect. And this can happen when you delay the impact of a message that occurs over time. So a message that you initially discounted actually becomes effective because you remember the message, but you tend to forget the reason for actually discounting it. So this is the idea of a message that you may not agree with at the time. Later on, when you forget why you discounted it or why you were against it, it can kind of be newly effective in changing your beliefs. So now credibility and believability are going to be changed by a lot of different things. So based on kind of credibility can be defined in different ways. Sometimes it's seen as in terms of expertise, but then other times it can be affected by things like your in-group, out-group. So who is similar to me, who is non-similar to me, and that can change how believable you think that someone is. So credibility is often affected by perceived expertise, the speaking style, so how it is that someone communicates their message, and then whether or not you trust that particular person. One other big component to the influence of the communicator themselves is the attractiveness. So attractiveness, and this has been shown in several different studies, based on how attractive we perceive a person to be, that will affect how we think of the communicator. And so the attractiveness can be just kind of just purely physical attractiveness, so how physically attractive someone is, and then also how similar they are to us. So the more ways that a communicator can demonstrate that they are just like us or similar to us, or that there's certain similarities between us, it increases their attractiveness and makes us more willing to actually listen to what it is that they're saying. So appealing communicators are most persuasive on matters of subjective preference. So we tend to appeal. We tend to listen to communicators about certain things that are subjective to us when they're similar to us in some way or another. These are the 6 persuasion principles that comes from the YouTube video that you looked at, the science of persuasion. So I won't go over these again because they do a good job, but you'll want to know you'll also want to know these as well. Okay, so second we'll go to the message content. And so this is what is being said in the message itself. And whether or not we're using some reason or emotion within the message will often depend on the type of audience that we're trying to share. So we can look at the education and motivation involved in the message, whether or not someone is going to be disinterested or not, and how those attitudes are actually formed. So one thing that often enhances persuasion is good feelings. So if the message can increase positive feelings or feelings of likeness, that can help with the persuasion. And then messages can also be very effective by actually going the opposite way, by trying to induce fear or negative types of emotions. And that's probably one of the reasons why negative political ads can be so effective in terms of a persuasion. Because the negative ads or the attack ads are trying to induce in the observer the kind of negative feelings that would move them away from or repel them from that particular message or that particular person. Also, in terms of the message, the context can make a big difference. And these are kind of well-known different types of effects that can change whether or not we accept or are persuaded by different kinds of messages. So the foot in the door phenomenon is the tendency to get someone to agree to a small request first, and then they're more likely to comply with a larger request later. So the idea is if you ask someone to do something that's too large, too much work, or takes them too far outside of their comfort zone, it's going to be harder to change their mind or persuade them. But if you can get them to agree to something small, if you can get them to take a small step in a certain direction, you're more likely to get that larger compliance later on. So that's the idea of getting your foot in the door. Get your foot in the door with a small amount of compliance, and you can increase the compliance or persuasion later on. A second type of technique is the low ball technique. And this is where people who agree to an initial request will often still comply when the requester ups the ante. So people who receive only the costly request are less likely to actually comply. And so this is the same sort of thing. We start with something lowball, or we start with something that's not as significant, and then we increase it later. So instead, you initially request something rather large. You make a larger request. You ask for something a whole lot more, which immediately gets shut down. But then you counter offer with something much less. And so that feeling of having to, in a sense, close the door on someone or put the door in their face, saying no to that first request makes it seem like the second request, which is smaller, a little bit easier to swallow or to take in. Aspect of looking at the messages is when you know that your audience is going to be exposed to opposing views. Many times it's actually better to simply acknowledge the other perspective, to let them know that you're aware of this other type of views. And by acknowledging that, you can actually allow for your argument to actually be heard. Whereas if you go in with only your argument and you already know that your audience has been exposed to or is already thinking about that other view, it can be harder to persuade them. So instead, you just kind of acknowledge that other view, realize that it's there, which kind of confirms what your audience is already looking at, and then you kind of offer that kind of two-sided appeal. Part two, looking at this message, is looking at the primacy effect and the recency effect. This is kind of an interesting part of looking at the message, because this actually conforms to what we know about memory in terms of what is remembered most from a list. If you look at basic kind of aspects of memory, you'll find that people either remember things from the start of a list or things at the end of a list. And the same thing applies in terms of looking at multiple messages. So in terms of the primacy effects, when all other things are equal, information that is presented first usually has the most influence. So if you are trying to present your idea, it's typically best to go first, especially if someone is going right after you. Because when someone goes right after you, the first person tends to be remembered better. And that's because that information is already being held in memory. And by being held in memory, it can sometimes interfere with the second message. Now, the recency effect can be at play as well. And this is where information that is presented last sometimes has the most influence. Overall, though, the primacy effect tends to have more of an influence than the recency effect. However, the recency effect can be more effective depending on when the messages are given. So when we look at the timing of the messages, so the one on top is the primacy effect. So when you have message 1 that's immediately followed by message 2, then message 1 tends to be more accepted. Whereas the recency effect works better if there is some sort of time gap between message 1 and message 2. So when there is a gap of time between when you hear the first message and the second message, then the recency effect tends to occur, because message 1 tends to be forgotten easier, and thus message 2 can take more root or take more hold in what someone is actually thinking about. So in terms of the channel, meaning how is something said, meaning the way that a message is delivered can have an effect on how persuasive it is. So we can think about, there's several different channels that are the ways that a message is actually presented. So you can present something face-to-face, you can present something in writing, you can use a film, or you can use some other type of media. What actually affects attitudes the most is when you are actively experiencing or relating to some sort of message. So that's why face-to-face sorts of encounters can be so productive in terms of persuading someone. But the more you move away from face-to-face contact, at times, the less persuasive your message can be. So when we look at things like written and visual appeals, because they're more passive, they tend to not do as well. However, if you repeat something enough, if you repeat it, or if you rhyme a particular statement, if you find other ways to make a particular message catchy, you can increase its fluency and its believability. But overall, it seems to be the case that face-to-face still is the best way to go about it, but it can be helped by certain types of media. In general, face-to-face or person-to-person contact has a greater influence than most types of media. So that's why modern selling often strives to use more word of mouth, and that's why things like on Instagram and YouTube, you try to have social influencers who use different products and try to make it seem as if they're not advertising for the products, but they're actually just simply using them and then trying to share that information with you or with their followers. So it feels more like a person-to-person kind of interaction, which may have a larger influence. There can sometimes be a two-step flow to a communication, so that media can often influence or occurs through certain types of opinion leaders, who in turn actually influence others. With media, the more persuasive and the more lifelike. So the order of persuasiveness is live, videotaped, audio taped, and written. So if you're using media, the more lifelike the media can be, the more potential influence it has. So when you're giving some kind of a persuasive speech that's live and persons are watching as it's occurring, that is a little bit more persuasive than actually videotaping some sort of message, or then audio taping, and then finally writing a particular message. This may be tapping into certain aspects of our evolutionary psychology in terms of as we evolved as human persons, and in terms of our sociability, we're most used to working with people one-on-one and deciding whether we trust them based on one-to-one types of contact. So the closer our the closer the channel is to that one-to-one face-to-face contact, the more likely it is to have an effect on us. However, messages tend to be best comprehended and recalled when they are written. And that's why, especially in psychology, we read psychology books, we read journal articles, because to really understand a particular argument or a particular idea within psychology, we have to read that, we have to read about that idea, study that idea to allow it to get more into our minds. So here's 3 different types of ways that they tried to influence persons in 3 different cities, Tracy, Gilroy, and Watsonville. And they were trying to see how well they could reduce heart attacks and factors involved in heart attacks. And what they found is when you use both face-to-face interactions as well as mass media, as you see with the Watson example, it had the biggest effect in terms of reducing the coronary risk. Mass media still did have a pretty good effect in terms of reducing aspects of it, and both of them did much better than the control group. So when we look at and begin to think about the audience, we can think about 2 different types of characteristics. One is the age of our audience. So based on the age of the persons you're trying to talk to, there are different types of strategies that you'll want to use. So whether they're the same age as you, or whether they're older, or whether they're younger, can have an effect on how you should try to communicate your message to persuade them. Secondly, you have to look at how thoughtful your audience is, meaning how invested are they already? What is their particular thinking state? How either skeptical or receptive are they to what it is that you're saying? And that can affect what kind of strategy you should try to use. So social psychologists offer 2 particular explanations for the effects of age. One is called the life cycle explanation. And this is the idea that attitudes tend to change as persons get older. And especially that as persons get older, they tend to become more conservative. And so that viewpoint tends to happen the older persons get. The other one is a generational explanation. And this is the idea that attitudes of certain people do not change, and that rather older people tend to hold on to the attitudes they adapted when they were young. And so there's kind of two, basically depending on the message, it can have two different possible reasons for how those attitudes change based on age. So for example, when we look at what people think about same-sex marriage and whether they think that it's okay or not, we can see that overall, younger folks, people from 18 to 29 years of age, are much more likely to be okay with same-sex marriage, whereas those who are 65 years of age and older are much less likely to agree with or be okay with a same-sex marriage. And you can see that both examples could actually work. It could be the case that over time, older folks have simply become much more conservatives in their beliefs, and because of that conservatism, it leads them to be more anti or against same-sex marriage. But actually the other, or a second possible explanation for this split in views on this particular issue, is that as people get older, because they already believed that, or did not believe in same-sex marriage, which was more of the general belief earlier on, especially in the United States, that particular belief has simply stuck around. So we see that both explanations could actually be true in this particular instance. And it would take more data and more investigation into these processes to know the reasons for this generational difference in terms of beliefs about same-sex marriage. So when we look at kind of what an audience is actually thinking, there's several things to consider. And the degree of thoughtfulness is very important. So one crucial aspect is not the message itself, but the responses it evokes. So if you already have an idea of what your audience is going to be thinking or what their attitudes are, you need to be careful in terms of when you say it to the audience, because based on how it's said or what's said to them, and if you can have some kind of idea about what kind of responses the message may evoke, you can be thoughtful about the way that you actually present it to that particular audience. So for example, when someone is forewarned, they are forearmed. So if someone already has certain ideas about what your message is going to be, you need to have a certain amount of counter arguments set up or thought through, because you know that someone is going to be more, not necessarily more defensive, but more ready to produce counter arguments to what it is that you're actually saying. Sometimes you can use distraction, so you can engage in different aspects of conversation, which can disarm certain kinds of counter arguments. Uninvolved audiences tend to use more peripheral cues. So if you know that your audience is not going to be as attentive or maybe as interested, you may want to go more of the peripheral route in terms of trying to convince them of something. You want them, the more they can think about something, so their motivation, their level of motivation to either think or analyze a particular message will be important to take note of in terms of what it is that they're doing. When you're trying to initiate cognition or initiate kind of thinking about a particular message, the more stimulating you can make the message, meaning the more that you can kind of induce cognition or induce thinking about it, works best for stronger messages. But it's less persuasive for more weak messages. So the better your argument is for something, the more you can stimulate someone's thinking about it is going to be your best bet. But if you don't have the best kind of argument, if your argument is weak, it'll tend to be less persuasive the more you get someone to actually think about it. So being persuaded comes really naturally. It's actually easier for us to accept persuasive messages than to doubt them. Our general tendency is when someone says something, unless there's some other kind of circumstance, we tend to believe that it's true. Resist different kinds of falsehoods is through logic, information, and motivation. So the more that we can use our own rationality or our critical thinking skills, the more we can gain new types of information about an issue, and then the more we can be motivated to be either skeptical or at least not easily manipulated, we can help to counter different kinds of falsehoods. One thing is to rethink our habitual responses to authority, to make sure that when we're being influenced by someone, that it's not just because they're a authority figure, but because we have agreed with or understand what types of reasoning is going on. It's important as well to try to seek more information, find out more about what it is that you're looking for, and to try to question the things that we don't understand. So a few other ways that persuasion can be resisted. One is through attitude inoculation. And this is when we expose people to weak attacks upon their attitudes so that when the stronger attacks come, they will have refutations available. So it's, in some ways, it's kind of like a type of training. It's a way to kind of allow people to think through different kinds of counter arguments by giving them kind of a weaker argument to deal with. And then once you've kind of allowed them to deal with the weaker arguments, then when a stronger argument actually occurs, they'll have some sort of information or something that they can actually think through and understand to try to help them deal with something. Of course, in addition to inoculation, would be simply working out more and more counter arguments. So understanding reasons why a persuasive message might be wrong. Some examples of this might be inoculating children against peer pressure to smoke, or trying to inoculate children against the influence of advertising. With some research that was done, they worked with inoculating children about smoking at one particular school, and then they didn't do that, or they used another control school to look at how the percentage of students who were smoking. And as you can tell, the control school had a much higher percentage of smoking that the students were engaging in comparison to the inoculated school. When we look at the attitudes, at the implications of attitude inoculation, the best way to build resistance is likely not just stronger indoctrination. Instead, it's kind of getting students, or getting persons to understand the arguments for themselves and to understand why the arguments are persuasive. Also, educators should be wary of creating a germ-free ideological environment, meaning that if you have an environment that has only one specific viewpoint and doesn't allow for engagement of multiple ideas and multiple perspectives, you won't allow students to be trained in ways of thinking for themselves and thinking through different possible types of reasoning and arguments for a particular issue. So people who live among diverse views become much more discerning and are more likely to modify their views only in response to credible arguments. Okay, so that finishes up my thoughts on Chapter 7. I'll have more of these lectures coming up soon.